right, welcome everyone. We're going to get started pretty soon. If you want to take part with us on your phone, you can log on to Adams12CAN, and we're going to be asking you some questions, mostly at the beginning and the end of the presentation. There are also sign-in sheets at your table. You can sign in, or we'll also be asking for your name and email if you would like to provide it through that app. So you can sign in either way. We're hoping people will want to stay involved with our group after tonight's presentation. So we have a lot of information to cover, and I'm going to introduce Shannon Hancock, who is part of our CAN group, and here's the magic wand. So thanks for coming, everybody. Here's Shannon.
Hi, everyone. I want to echo what Kathy said. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I know we all have very busy lives, and this seems overwhelming before you come here, so thank you for making the effort. On the Socratic Method site, I was just playing with it, and just so you know, you go to the website and you click on student login, and then you can enter the classroom number there. So I was just testing it out myself. So I'm Shannon Hancock. I'm a parent of a 6th grader at Westlake Middle School. You guys can all sigh for me. I was actually just telling a couple people, I think I'm about 2 or 3 months away from the bad stuff, so far we still like each other. I came into this group just as a parent concerned about what's going on in the community, wanting to understand our schools better, wanting to meet other parents from different schools to hear what they have to say. I'm passionate about our public schools, and I believe in the neighborhood school, and I want it to be the best possible for all of our kids. So that's why I'm here. But tonight, we are talking about Adams 12 in general. We're talking about increasing expenses and limited revenues that are going on in our district. And I'm so glad that there's so many people that are concerned about what's going on with the status of our schools, because they are our schools. Adams12CAN, we are the Community Action Network associated with Adams 12 schools. We are a separate parent organization that gets together in people's living rooms and in car dealership meeting spaces and wherever else people will have us. But it's just a group of volunteers that want to get out and have conversations in the community. We're a grassroots organization that we're all about educating, inspiring, and engaging the community in what's going on with our schools and our children, and we really want to secure the future of our public schools. All right, tonight, this is why we're all here, right? Can I just take a quick poll? How many people are employees of the district? I thought that might be the case. Hi, welcome. Thank you so much for all that you guys do. I mean, honestly, like my son has had an incredible experience. He's always been at Adams 12, and every single employee I've encountered has just been passionate about their work, so thank you. Tonight we want to talk about the state budget situation overall. It's not just about Adams 12, it's about the entire state and what's going on. We're going to talk about competing amendments in our schools. We're going to talk about then the Adams 12 budget and what that means for us on a local level. And then I want to talk for a few minutes about what we can do from here as community members. Tonight, we have 3 wonderful speakers. We have Natalie Mullis. She is the Chief Economist of the Colorado Legislative Council. We have Carol Hedges, Executive Director of the Colorado Fiscal Institute, and Suzi DeYoung, the Chief Financial Officer for Adams 12. With no further ado, I would really like to welcome Natalie up here. Again, she's the Chief Economist of the Legislative Council staff. Natalie, thank you so much for making time for us tonight. Can you have a round of applause?
Thanks, and it's an honor to be here today. I head up the nonpartisan economics staff for the state legislature. And we serve the entire state legislature, both the House and the Senate. And our jobs don't change when, the parties who are in control of those change, because we're nonpartisan. My staff puts together economic and revenue forecasts 4 times a year. In fact, we're presenting a brand new one next Friday. So I'm very excited about that. But I did bring one copy, just that way in front of you, of the one we presented in December. This is on our website. If you have a copy of these slides, or if you just want to Google Colorado Legislative Forecast, you'll be able to find the forecast. And we work very hard to put a good explanation of what we think is going on in the economy in this document. So if you're interested in that, check it out. I am the mom of an 8th grader just finishing up, just finishing up middle school. And at Aspen Creek Elementary, I actually K through 8, which is just over the district line from here in Boulder Valley School District. In fact, it's like, I don't know, a quarter of a mile from Sharon, which is the district line between BVSD and you guys. So it is an honor to be here today. I can tell, I can't find her, but I can tell you that you do survive middle school. We're almost, we registered for high school last week, and both of us are very excited. I want to give you some context for the education budget, and I mean the entire education budget for the state today. When I talk about the entire education budget, I'm talking about the entire state, all 178 school districts, the school finance money, which we, in the capital call total program, total amount of money spent on the school finance formula. Where does the money come from? What's the outlook for that money? Where are we right now for that budget outlook? How did we get here, and where are we going? This is kind of hard to see, so, and there's a few copies of the handouts there on your tables, so maybe look on with somebody else if you don't have enough. For school finance really comes from two major places. It comes from the state's general fund, which is gold in these handouts, which is mostly income and sales taxes. State's general fund is the state's general operating fund, where it operates, where it pays for what you would normally think about as government spending, education, healthcare, courts, prisons, human services programs, and general government. And then you have the local share, which is your property taxes that your school district collects. Whatever your school district collects, the difference between that and the total amount that the formula would give you is paid for by the general fund, and we call that state share. So, state share is paid for by the general fund and what we call the state education fund, which is kind of like an augment to the general fund. It has income taxes in it. It gets its revenue from income taxes. And this shows you our expectations for that revenue. It shows you the history, actually, of the last two business cycles. This is, if you look at the bottom, that's $4 billion at the bottom. So it's not quite as drastic as all that, but it was a pretty drastic drop. Actually, during the last two recessions. It doesn't show you, this year right here, this is the first year of that recession that happened right after the turn of the century. That year and the year that the Great Recession hit, our general fund revenues fell by 15%, and then a couple more percentage points the year after that, during both recessions. And that is a pretty significant drop in revenue, very volatile source of revenue. We have been expanding now with the economy for the last 6 years or so. You can see that showing up in our revenue here in the bar chart. But revenue growth is slowing down. For this year, which is the first year that you see in those lighter bars, you see the dots there too, that's the governor's forecast, the governor's staff's forecast. We expect 1.8% growth in general fund revenue. That's negative if you adjust it for population and inflation. It's negative if you adjust it just for population, because population in Colorado grew 1.9% last year. So really very, very slow revenue growth. There are a few things going on in our economy that's slowing growth. We have a very strong services economy right now in the nation and in Colorado. Consumers are really driving growth in our economy right now, but we have a significant slowdown in our commodities markets. So agriculture and the metals, and the big one, oil and gas. Colorado is an oil and gas state, and we are seeing a significant slowing in our corporate income taxes. We're expecting to see slowing in our estimated individual income taxes because of that. So really slow growth in the state's share of the amount of money that's available to pay for the state's share of education. The other source, local share, paid for with property taxes and some specific ownership taxes, but specific ownership taxes, which are those taxes you pay on your car every year with your registration, they're a very small amount. This shows you basically percent change in the property tax space split out by residential and non-residential. So non-residential is like businesses, commercial, this is agriculture, those kinds of things, oil and gas. Oil and gas moves that non-residential line quite a bit. And we had a bit of a, how many of you are paying your property taxes now and they went up quite a bit? They went up a lot. Yeah. This shows a lot. It shows you what happens statewide. Residential values went up by almost 19% statewide. This means more revenue for your school district, for Adams 12. Speaking of Adams 12, in Adams 12, overall residential assessed value went up by 19%, a little bit more than the state as a whole. So extra property taxes, actually more than was expected when the state legislature put the budget together, to the tune of $135 million. Compared, so it's basically more money than the state expected when it put its budget together for school finance last year. And that must mean, right then, that your school gets more money, right? More property taxes collected by your school district. Does that mean that your school district gets more money? No, actually not this year. So that leads me to where are we with the budget? These are two charts, one's for the state, one's for Adams 12. And here in these gray lines, you see billions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 billion, 100 million, 200 million, 300 million for Adams State. And what you can see at the top of that bar, where it says formulas at the top of the blue, that is what the school district, the school finance formula that's in state statute, would put your funding if it was fully funding the formula. The way the school finance formula works is there's a base per pupil funding amount, and then the state adds what are called factors. There are factors for cost of living, at-risk students, and a couple of other things. During the recession, the legislature added what we call the negative factor. And the negative factor is represented by this blue rectangle here. So here you have what the formula gives you. Here you have the base. Add all the factors up, subtract the negative factor, and you're right here. At about 300 million instead of, what is that? Probably $340 million. I know Suzi has more information, more specific information for you. Similar situation for the state. We're in a tough spot. We're 11.8% lower than the formula. That blue rectangle was 11.8% of the total formula. The state general fund budget is in cutting mode. I just explained that revenue is growing by less than population growth right now, not even accounting for inflation. State education fund, which is another source of money for education, is close to being depleted. So for the last few years, some growth in the budget for education was financed out of a one-time windfall of money to this fund that happened a few years ago. That one-time windfall of money is being spent down. And so it's really not available anymore, which creates a little mini cliff within the general fund budget that has to deal with on top of the fact that revenue is not growing very fast. And even though property tax values are up, that doesn't mean that your school is going to get, or your school district is going to get any more money. Why is that? Somebody want to pipe in and tell me why that is? Because I know some of you know. Anybody? Because that blue rectangle, the negative factor, that can be adjusted. You guys are going to collect more money? Okay, fine then. We're just going to adjust the negative factor so that that money is actually saved in the state's budget and not in your budget. And in fact, that is what the General Assembly did with what we call the supplementals, which is the mid-year budget adjustments this year. They adjusted it, the negative factor fell from $855 million to $831 million because costs went down. Enrollment was lower than expected. So costs went down, that changed the numbers and said, okay, your negative factor now instead of statewide $855 million is now $831 million, but really the amount of money that your district got didn't change. It got more money from its property tax base, less money from the state. Okay, that's where we are. How did we get here? There's two things to talk about. One is the legal situation for how we got here. The other one is the financial situation, and that one's pretty easy to understand. Everybody remembers the Great Recession, right? General. I was promoted to chief economist in February of 2009, which was when we were losing, thousands and thousands of jobs every month. It was really fun. Actually, I loved it. I didn't love the recession. I loved the challenge. So the financial situation is just that we had a huge drop in revenue, both property taxes over time and also more immediately general fund revenue that could fund the state. And the state went into a serious budget shortfall, which resulted in that negative factor, resulted in cuts to schools. The legal situation is takes a little bit longer to talk about. And I like to kind of tell a story about this. I'm going to start talking about the Gallagher Amendment. I'm going to talk about Tabor and just a little bit of one mention of Amendment 23. This is that what people call the constitutional knot and how it affects our budget. A lot of people think this is really complicated. It really doesn't have to be complicated if you kind of tell it like a story. So, back in 1980, 1981, the state legislature wanted to give its constituents, the taxpayers, a tax break, in particular homeowners. They wanted to reduce property taxes for homes, for residents. So, they referred a measure to the voters, and it created a significant cut in property taxes for homes, for residential property, and a little tiny tax break for non-residential property. But in the process, the political process, the sausage process of putting that referred measure together, there was a member of the legislature called Dennis Gallagher, who recently just retired from the city and county of Denver as their auditor, actually. But he was in the legislature back in 1980, 1981, and he said, you know what? We don't want homeowners to have to pay any more than their fair share, which they're paying right now, in property taxes ever. So right now, homeowners are paying 45% of the property taxes in the state. And I want them to always pay 45% of the property taxes in the state. So if the value of your home grows really, really fast, and oil and gas craters, so the value of non-residential property taxes, that tax base falls, what would happen if you didn't change anything else is that homeowners would start paying more than 45% of the total pie. So there had to be some kind of, if you wanted to keep it at 45%, there had to be some kind of mathematical equation that they could put together to, bring it back down to 45%. What they did is they said, okay, we'll do that by adjusting the residential assessment rate, which is a term of art, a tax term of art. It's graphed right here in the blue line from 1983, after the Gallagher Amendment and that referred measure was passed, through to 2015. The residential assessment rate is basically just the taxable value of your home. So, for income taxes, let's just say, I know this is a huge amount of money, that you make $100,000 a year. It's unrealistic for most of us, I know. You might have taxable income of $70,000. If you own, let's say, a $100,000 house, and the residential assessment rate is 21%, which it was when the Gallagher Amendment was passed, then your taxable value of your home would be $21,000. So just like income taxes, you apply the tax rate to that $70,000 taxable income. For property taxes, you take that $21,000 in taxable property value, and you apply the mill levy, which is basically the tax rate. So what they did is, in order to keep that pie at 45-55, they said, okay, if residential property grows a lot faster than non-residential property, we'll just reduce the residential assessment rate. And it brings it back into balance. And what happened over time is exactly that. You can see that during the 80s and the 1990s, up until about 2004, that continuously happened, and the residential assessment rate fell from 21% to 7.96%, where it is today. So that meant that fewer property taxes were collected. Property taxes still grew, but they didn't grow as fast as they would have otherwise. The next thing that happened in 1991, 1992, was the Tabor Amendment. Can anyone of you tell me what Tabor stands for? Thank you for speaking up. Yes, it stands for the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. It's passed in 1992 by the voters. It was initiated by a citizen whose name is Douglas Bruce. It requires a vote to increase taxes. And it specifically says in the language that it requires a vote to increase any assessment rate. So while Gallagher thought that assessment rate could go up and down, Tabor put the kibosh on that. So now it can only go down, it cannot go back up. It also said that for districts that have not quote-unquote de-Bruced, we'll talk about what that is later, it's clearly named after Douglas Bruce, it requires mill levies to be reduced, to be cut, when property tax revenue grew too fast. And when did property tax revenue grow too fast? It grew too fast when it grew faster than what Tabor called its constitutional revenue limit. So every district, every government in the state had a new limit on the amount of revenue they could collect and spend. For school districts, if property taxes grew faster than that limit, which is basically enrollment plus inflation, enrollment growth plus inflation, then the mill levies had to fall. So not only did we have the assessment rate falling, but we had the mill levy falling. So, before Tabor, school districts could say, okay, the residential assessment rate has fallen, I'm going to raise my mill levy to make up for that. But once Tabor was passed, not only could the residential assessment rate not float up, but the mill levy started to ratchet down. And they no longer have the power and the control to do that. In 2007, you can see that that red line flattens out. There was a change to state law that said that for school districts that had quote-unquote de-Bruced, meaning that there had been a vote, where the people, the constituents, the voters in that district had said, you can keep your money above the limit. For any district that had done that, the mill levies didn't have to fall anymore, and they were frozen. And your mill levy was frozen at looks like 20 mils. Is that right? 20 mils. For most of them, it was frozen at 27. And maybe I have this. I put this together. This is the statewide average mill levy, I'm sorry. It's an average mill levy. Some of them are smaller, yeah.
We are at 27. We were actually a little bit higher before that happened, and so we got a little bit of tax relief, and now we're frozen at 27.
Thank you, Chris.
Will you explain really quick what 27 or 20 means?
A mill is that is a 1,000. So 1 mill is $8 out of $1,000 of taxable value. So 8 times 27. Somebody in here can probably do better math than me. Is for every $1,000 of tax value would be what you pay. Taxable value after you apply the residential assessment rate. This slide that you cannot see shows you for Adams 12 the growth in your property tax value, both residential and non-residential, and what happened to your mill levy. In your handout, this is mislabeled. So get a pen out and change it. You're going to keep it. It's not the state share, it's the mill levy. Adams 12 state share has actually grown. Back in 1983, I looked this up. The state paid for 75% of Adams 12 school finance, and now it's about 80%. So just a little bit. And the state paid 75% of Adams 12 budget, and now I believe it's 80%. And Suzi can correct me if I'm wrong. It was 75% in 1983, and it's 80% now, this year. I don't have more packets, I'm sorry. I brought too few, but these will be available, I believe, online. And you can email me, my email address is on my website, just Google it, on the Legislative Council staff website. And you can email me and I'll give it to you. So what happened then, in 2001, some of you might remember this, people were concerned about school finance funding not growing and not keeping up with inflation, and so there was a citizen-initiated movement to pass Amendment 23 that said, okay, we've got all these things that are dampening growth in property taxes, but we want school finance, we want education funding to keep up. And so Amendment 23 is passed by the voters. It requires the base funding. It hasn't always been interpreted this way. We actually recently had a Supreme Court decision just earlier this year. It said that the base funding, which was that red bar, had to increase every year by inflation. There was more to it than that, but that's where we are right now. So over time, what we have is a reversal in who pays for education in this state. Who pays for the majority of education? In this figure, you see the blue line, that's the local share, which is mostly property taxes, and then you see the gold line, that's the state share. And back in 1983 and 1985, it was 57% property taxes, with the rest being state share. With dampening growth in property taxes, with the drop in the residential assessment rate and the drop in the mill levies over time, and then starting in 2001, you see Amendment 23 right here, a requirement that spending increased by a certain amount every year. There was a lot of pressure on the state to pick up a bigger and bigger share of funding, and it reversed. It reversed it then even more so to where now we're at state share of 2/3 and local government share of 1/3. Remember that chart that I showed you of general fund revenue? It was the gold bars, and I said this is really volatile. The sales and income taxes, especially income taxes in Colorado, are very volatile and can fall very fast, very quickly during a recession. It doesn't have to be the Great Recession. It did the same thing in the 2001 recession as it did in 2008 and 2009. We are paying for education right now using a very volatile source of revenue. That's the bottom line. And this is what happened. This is the financial background. This shows you average per pupil funding for the entire state. Here we are, 2008-09, first year after the recession started. That's when the negative factors started kicking in. You can see the impact on the average per pupil funding for the state. And then we finally this year got up to above those pre-recession levels. This is not adjusted for inflation. If we looked at, and you can't even see this at all on this slide, above this blue line right here is kind of a gray area. And these numbers right here tell you how big that gray number is. So this number right here is $1.1 billion. So for the entire state school finance, that negative factor started out at a recession of 130 million, got bigger, so that it was at 1.1 billion in fiscal year 2012-13, a few years ago, stayed there, and then basically the state has been trying to catch up after that and buy down that negative factor. In order to buy down that negative factor, it has to increase funding by more than inflation plus enrollment, right? Because the negative factor is the difference between the formula, which grows by inflation plus enrollment, and wherever that funding is. If you want that difference to shrink, you have to grow it by inflation plus enrollment and then some. So this has been, I know this has been a priority for the majority of the state legislature, especially the people who are working on the budget, to try to buy that down. But the state's budget has kind of been like a jogger. Like we have two joggers, the formula is one jogger, the state budget is another jogger. During the Great Recession, so they're jogging along, state budget fell, the formula kept going. And the state's gotten back up again, but it can't quite catch up. And that's where we've been. Where are we going? Well, the economy and revenue is growing. But tough budgets are here to stay. There are 3 reasons for that. On top of everything I've already told you about how we got here, where we are, I'm going to tell you that tough budgets are here to stay, and that joggers are not going to run very fast, at least for the foreseeable future. And there are 3 reasons for that. We've got structural issues in our budget. It's not just education that has cost pressures. We've hit our TABOR, our state revenue limit under TABOR, and so we kind of know how much money we're going to have. If the state brings in more money, it's not new money for the budget. It has to be refunded to taxpayers. And then we have this from the use of one-time monies. So earlier in this conversation, I told you that the state has been using some money out of what I remember the state education fund, got money out of years ago, of over $1 billion, right? And the state legislature has been using that to help that jogger run faster, to buy down the negative factor over the last few years. But the problem is $1 billion is just $1 billion, and we were down $1 billion every year. So it's like paying the rent out of your savings account. It's not going to be sustainable. And we've hit that with the state education fund. So now it has to all come out of the general fund. And remember I told you, general fund revenue is not growing very fast right now. What does the general fund pay for? This is a pie chart of what that operating budget for general government is. K through 12 education, 37%, higher education, 9%. Then you have our prisons, courts, healthcare, which is mostly Medicaid, human services programs. Those are those federally required programs, that are administered at the county. Money flows to the state. Temporary for new families, food stamps, for the disabled and the elderly, those kinds of things. And then other, that 6% is like 12 or 13 other departments, like Department of Revenue, the legislature, the governor's office, Department of Agriculture, Department of Local Affairs, Department of Military and Veterans Affairs, That's what it pays for. We have a structural problem in our budget. And that is the things that it pays for, the cost for it, grow faster than our revenue over time. I'm talking about Medicaid caseload, inflation, those kinds of things. This chart shows you over the last 2 business cycles an index of the growth in things that drive costs in our budget, which include Medicaid caseload, state share of school finance, higher education enrollment, K through 12 enrollment, compared to general fund revenue, which is here in the black line here, general fund appropriations. This is the last 2 business cycles. It's only getting worse because of the aging of our population. So what we see here is that it's not just education that's saying we need you to restore our cuts. There's cost pressures in Medicaid and higher education, most of what you see here. We've hit our TABOR limit. This chart shows you a picture of the state's TABOR situation. Hi, Carol. Since TABOR was enacted in 1982, the bars are revenue subject to TABOR. When revenue subject to TABOR gets above these lines, we have a TABOR surplus, money above the TABOR limit that the state does not keep and spend on its budget, but must refund to taxpayers. How many of you have filled out your quarterly income tax form yet this year? So you've seen your refund, right? Have you seen your refund? The sales tax refund? Yeah, or if you qualify, you might have also gotten an earned income tax credit, which Carol knows a whole lot about. So we don't expect one this year, but we do expect one in the next 2 years. So we have hit our limit. That means that if the state collects more money, more sales and income tax revenue, it's not new money. It doesn't help our budget situation. And this is a chart that tries to explain kind of the tough situation we're in right this year for our budget that we're writing for next year for education. The top chart shows you the year-end balance for the state education fund, That's where we end. Basically, it's a trade-off when we look at increasing funding for education every year, take money from the general fund, take money from the state education fund. You know, if you don't have enough money to take out of the state education fund to pay for your increase, you got to find money in the general fund. So this shows you a history of how much money has come out of the general fund, new money. This is the increase every year, 199 million. This is last year, fiscal year 14-15. But we spent a lot of money out of the state education fund that year. It was falling. This year, again, we've fallen. We expect to be at 297 million year-end balance in the education fund, and we're spending $115 million on the general fund to get there. We are tapping out that state education fund. Looks like it's disappeared. Sorry about that. If we assume that we're going to keep 100 million in the state education fund every year from here on out, starting with fiscal year 16-17, which starts next July, the next state fiscal year that we're budgeting for right now, then we're going to have $278 million out of the general fund this year, the general fund, to pay for that. Almost 300 the year after that, 182 million the year after that. This is all based on forecasts. These numbers change all the time. In fact, the newest number is a little bit different. I think it's 282 or something. Let's move just a little bit. But we don't have that amount of money in the general fund. Before the supplementals, those mid-year adjustments, we were looking at new money of $274 million for everything for the state budget for next year. And here we need $278 million just to keep our state education fund balance at $100 million and the negative factor flat. So we're growing by enrollment plus inflation. So to grow your funding by enrollment plus inflation and keep at least $100 million in the state education fund balance, we need more money than we have. That was the situation that the legislature was looking at for next year's budget when they put together the mid-year adjustments for the budget this year. The biggest, I think the only big part of the mid-year adjustment for this year was what I was talking about at the very beginning of my talk. When you guys got more property taxes this year, what happened? The state said, great, you made more money, we're not going to give you as much. Because they didn't give you as much, they got to reduce their spending in the general fund by about $100 million. And because they reduced their spending in the general fund by about $100 million, that means that our baseline for growing the budget next year just fell. And there's more money for the budget next year because of that. So basically what the legislature did is say, we're going to save that money for next year. There is now more than $274 million available. It's actually, I think, and this has not been published or even mentioned very much publicly, but I think there's almost close to $500 million using the December forecast. Using our December forecast, more than what we were spending this year. That number's going to change. It's going to move. We're putting out a new forecast in a week and a half. That could change things. We could get new data from our state's accountants for the amount of money that we actually did last year with. That could change things. But it means that because of what happened with the mid-year adjustment, which was a bummer for your schools this year, there might be some money next year. And that is the end of my presentation. I think I actually went over, so I apologize for that. If you have questions for me, feel free. My contact information is on that handout. You can also just Google it. Just Google State Legislature Chief Economist, and you'll find me. My contact information is online. Feel free to call me, email me, and I'd be happy to talk with you.
Thank you very much, Natalie. I know that many of you probably have questions, so we'll be sure to put Natalie's contact information on our website. And if we don't get to all the questions at the end of our three speakers, if there's any time left in our schedule, we'll allow for a few questions to be asked at that time. Otherwise, we'll try to respond to those via the website as well as another potential option. So right now, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Carolyn Hedges. She is the Executive Director of the Colorado Fiscal Institute. That is a credible and independent and accessible information and analysis source of fiscal and economic issues facing Colorado. Carol has well over 15 years of experience in research, policy, and advocacy. She has authored a comprehensive study on the effect of the Colorado Taxpayer Bill of Rights. But as I learned today in a presentation that I attended, where she spoke, she does not like to refer to it that way. So I'm going to let Carol, I'll let you take over. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. I don't know how I told you, there's my magic wand. My name is Carol Hedges. I talk about tax and budget stuff. I like to say that my mom told me there were two things you weren't supposed to talk about in public. One of them was money, and the other one was politics, and I spent a lot of time talking about both in public, so sorry, Mom. It's not that I didn't respect you, but I've discovered something over time that if you really want to make a difference in your community, if you really want to know what's going on, follow the money. And that's what we're going to do tonight. I'm going to repeat a lot of what Natalie said. It's good, because that means we're saying the same thing, so it kind of indicates that maybe it's true. My experience with these issues are you have to hear them about 7 times before you actually understand them. So for those of you who've been exposed to school finance issues over time, that's 2 or 3 times, and then you heard Natalie, and that'll be 4, and I'll be 5, and a couple more times through you're going to feel like you're a star. I want to say before I get started that my organization, the Colorado Fiscal Institute, is really interested in getting you all to be stars on this topic. And we are, along with a whole bunch of other organizations, kicking off an initiative called Count Me In. And it's a civic engagement initiative that is designed to help people understand why it is so important to vote. And the interesting thing is we're not going to focus on, Donald or Hillary or what's going on at the top of the ticket, right? There's a lot of us, we've been doing a lot of public opinion work over the last 6, 8, 10 months, and a lot of people are pretty disillusioned, maybe is a nice way to say it. The other thing is check your watches before. I will swear at some point in this presentation, and it's always a question of how long it takes me to get there. I'm really trying to stop that. But so I stopped at disillusioned. I could have said something else. But anyway, a lot of people are really disillusioned by what's going on at the top of the ticket. And one of my concerns is that that's going to keep them from taking the effort to actually vote. The other thing that I'm really, really concerned about is that the ballot is going to be really long. Really long. And that people are going to tire out as they move through that ballot. Well, this Count Me In initiative that we're working on is really going to talk to folks, and we hope to train you, if you're interested, to also talk to folks about why it is so important to vote all the way down the ballot. I will make the argument, and I'm going to get to this in just a second, that the things that affect your community the most are not who is the President of the United States, not who is our United States Senator, while I think all of those things are important and we should pay attention to them. But I would suggest for you who are here tonight, the most important issues that are going to affect your lives, the lives of your children, and the quality of life in your community are going to be at the bottom. I have this crazy idea, Natalie knows I have a lot of crazy ideas, but one of the crazy ideas I have is to couple with the state's craft brewers and do a big push where we have pint glasses that say bottom up on the side, and when you get to the bottom and you tip it up to the glass, it says vote. So if anybody knows craft brewers who want to get engaged with this, let me know. We'd love to publicize them. I have some sign-up sheets for this Count Me In effort. We're going to be doing a training project, train the trainer activities to help you all talk about this in a better way, because it is hard. I have people tell me all the time, God, Carol, you really explained this really, really well. And then I see them 3 days later and they're like, you explained it really well, but I can't really remember what it was you were talking about. We're going to spend a whole day helping people better understand how to talk about these issues, because these issues at the bottom of the ballot are decided at backyard barbecues. They're decided in the conversations you have beside the women's soccer field or at the baseball game. Because with the political environment that we're in, there's not going to be a lot of television commercials. We're not going to have big forums that everybody's going to attend. It's going to be people like you who've already taken the step to be leaders, who need to understand these things and help your neighbors understand the importance of these issues at the bottom of the ballot, as well as give them some insight from your perspective on how they should vote. So let me know if you're interested in doing the Count Me In thing. Let me jump into this school finance basics thing for just a minute here. And I try to talk as simply as possible. I'm trying to get to the presentation that does not include a chart. All right? I run an organization that does research on economic issues, but I'm trying to learn to talk without charts. You'll see I failed miserably, but that's where we're trying to go. Let's start by saying that school funding comes from a combination of state and local sources with a little bit of federal funding. The formula that allocates money among the school districts in the state is an equalization formula. It is designed to implement the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution. That says, in essence, no matter where you live, you are entitled to, under the Equal Protection Clause, the same kind of education that everybody else gets. Now, let's be realistic. We haven't quite accomplished that. But that's where the formula started. That's where this whole thing that Natalie was talking about, property taxes and income taxes and allocations and all that stuff, it's designed to say you shouldn't be disadvantaged just because of where you live. And that's what, I think that's an important context for this conversation. There are three major components of the school finance formula. One is base funding, so like how much are we going to allocate per pupil? And let me just tell you one clear thing about that. It has nothing to do with what it costs to educate a kid. Sad as that seems, that's not where it starts. It's how much money is available. And I think Natalie's done a pretty good job of talking about how tough it is to find that money and why our current tax system isn't generating. Well, she didn't talk about why, but she talked about how our current tax system isn't generating enough. But for the major components of the formula, you've got base funding, and then you have something added to the base funding. So every kid in the state gets a base funding, and then per district, we add something called categorical funding. That's another little addition that we add on to that base. Those categories really go to the quality or the characteristics of the students in the district. So if you've got a lot of English language learners, if you've got a lot of low-income students in your district, you will be the amount you get as a district will be adjusted through these categories. And the third major component is something that's called, and I don't know why, the factors. And the factors are roughly the characteristics of the district. So if you're in a rural district where there are really high transportation costs, you get an adjustment. If your school district is in the mountains in a resort area and you have a super high relative to everybody else cost of living, there's a factor adjustment. I talk about this now because it will be relevant later, I promise you. Okay, I think Natalie showed you the slide. I won't spend much time on it today. About 67% of all dollars that are spent on schools across the state come from state tax dollars, income tax, sales taxes. Locally, from property taxes, we generate about 33% of what we spend on schools. Now, the state and local split, like how it's divided, varies dramatically from school district to school district. And it depends on property wealth. Back to that equalization notion. The amount of money per student is relatively the same, But the split, whether it comes from property taxes or from state income and sales taxes, depends a lot upon, it's on property wealth. So you can see in the Aspen School District in Pitkin County, it's about 25% of their budget from the state, and about 25% from the state, and about 75% from local property taxes. In Pueblo, it's the exact opposite. I'm not sure why this is doing that, but in Pueblo, the local share is about 25%, and the state share is about 75%. Local share is about 24, and state share is about 76. In Denver, the state contributes about 54% of the cost of educating kids. The local property tax base contributes about 46%. And in Adams 12, you're at 82% of the dollars that supported your kids come from the state share, and your local share contributes about 18%. Do you all know that? This is the source of a lot of controversy, this whole state and local match. Because if you're in this school district where you're paying for most of it yourself, you get kind of angry sometimes, or you're not as excited about state tax increases because you don't get as much money back to benefit your kids. But remember, we're doing this because we're trying to equalize educational opportunity. And that's something we sometimes forget. All right, you should have this handout. It's much clearer in front of you. But this comes from something we call the Purple Book. My organization produces the ultimate nerd guide. We call it the Compendium of Useful Fiscal Facts. Most people wonder what the heck we're talking about. But this is one of the pages of the Purple Book. I've reproduced it for you today. I'm going to break this down quickly, but I've gone through a lot of it. Like I said, Natalie went through a lot of this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Back in the 1980s, I really don't know, something about the way this is projecting. I'm getting funny-looking titles. But back in the 80s, in 1980, the local share, if you added it all up, locals were paying about 54% of the cost of providing education statewide, and the state was contributing about 46%. The difference between Colorado and U.S. per pupil funding, Colorado was about, I swear I looked at this, it didn't look like this when I projected it, was about $551 above the national average in funding for schools. This is 1980. The residential assessment rate, as Natalie talked about, was 21%, and the song of the year was Call Me! Remember that? You all remember that, right? You remember Blondie? All right. And then they had the Gallagher Amendment. Natalie talked to you about it. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about the Gallagher Amendment, except to say that it was designed also is trying to solve a fairness problem. The residential property tax relief component that Natalie talked about was almost an afterthought. What they were really trying to do is make property tax assessments fairer. Because we'd gotten into a situation where if I lived in a house here and I bought my house in 1972, and you were my neighbor and you bought your house in 1981, I was paying property taxes on the value in 1970 when I bought it in 1972, and you were paying it on 1981. Guess who was paying most property taxes? You were. And you weren't very happy about it. And so it was really an attempt to try to, and it did that as well. It required 2-year reassessment, reappraisal, required market approach for valuing property. But there was concern about fairness, as Natalie mentioned, and there was also, quite frankly, a concern about getting voters to approve it, because it was a constitutional amendment. And so this idea of keeping the residential property tax share the same was developed. It has been one heck of a deal, pretty good, for residential property tax payers. Those of us who own homes, we could have, had Gallagher not happened, been paying up to $3 billion more statewide in property taxes. If we had just kept this residential assessment rate where it was at 21%. It's one of those things that's invisible. We don't know what a great deal we got. My favorite story about residential property taxes in the state of Colorado is I was once talking to the CFO at Denver Public Schools. And he said he got a call from a guy who was mad as a hatter. The guy was just so mad he couldn't even hardly understand what he was saying. And David said, calm down, calm down. Talk to me. I understand you're concerned about your property tax bill. So do you have it in front of you? Now let's look at the number at the bottom in this box. And that is your annual property tax assessment. And the guy said, annual? I just moved here from New Jersey. I thought that was my monthly rate. In Colorado, we pay ridiculously low property taxes. We love that. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but we do. And one of the reasons is because of the Gallagher Amendment. Does anybody want to venture a guess about what the least popular tax that can be proposed to voters? The property tax. Nobody likes to pay it. So the chances that we're going to do something about this in an environment where our Constitution requires all tax increases be approved by voters is basically slim to none. Okay? And it is, as Natalie talked about, theoretically the primary source of funding for schools. But we've been retreating from the obligation for residential property tax owners to pay those taxes, which means that we're coming in and we're paying out of income taxes and sales taxes. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. So between 1982 and 1992, school districts had a couple of options. School boards could maintain local dollars, the amount of money was available for schools, by adjusting the mill levy up, right? As residential assessments went down and were generating less money, school boards could come in and raise mill levies. And they did that for 10 years, and so we didn't see much impact. Oh, here's my little formula. For those of you who don't know, your local property tax is your property value assessment rate and mill levy, and I know that Natalie talked about that as well. But when the property value, this isn't working, we're going to go past this one. The other thing is that they could raise taxes. Right? Legislators, school board members have the authority to raise taxes. But then we passed Article 10, Section 20, voters, 1992. And I had to tell you, I work with a bunch of economists and tax lawyers and stuff, and we are really nerdy. Like super, super nerdy. And so, on top of our nerdiness, we sit around and make up limericks. So we have a limerick that talks about the interaction between Gallagher and Tabor. Because of the 45-55 split, home assessment rates sure took a hit. But by adjusting their mills, they kept up local dollar bills. But after Tabor, that had to quit. And why is that? Because the Tabor Amendment, Article 10, Section 20, said that it took away the authority of our elected officials to raise taxes without voter approval. Now, many people think that is a really darn good idea because they don't trust politicians. But since the passage of Article 10, Section 20 in 1992, the state voters have voted to raise exactly 2 taxes. Anybody have any ideas what they are? I hear it. Marijuana. And what's the other one? Cigarettes. What do those things have in common? Somebody else pays them. Right? Nobody smokes pot in this room, and nobody smokes. Right? And so, it's taxes somebody else pays. Those are the ones we all like. We have not adjusted our tax rate, a general tax rate, since 1992. And I'm going to talk about this other provision of Tabor, and that's that Tabor rebate situation that Natalie was talking about a minute ago. And let me just clarify what I was talking when the comment was made that I don't like to use the actual constitutional name of Article 10, Section 20. I believe that, I honestly believe that if we tried to get on the ballot today, it wouldn't be called the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. I think it would be that it would be initiated and they wouldn't let that be the title because it's a misnomer. It's a catchphrase. We now don't let that stuff happen. But I will suggest to you that the idea of having a taxpayer bill of rights is a good one. We all want we all want rights as taxpayers. But I would suggest to you that is not really what Article 10, Section 20 of the Constitution does. It doesn't give us any rights. Prior to and today, voters at any time can pass any tax increase they want to. Prior to and today, taxpayers, voters, can repeal any tax they want to. What Article 10, Section 20 did is it took away the authority of our elected officials to do the things we elected them to do. And that is set priorities and fund public services. So that's why I don't use that term anymore. I try to call it Article 10, Section 20. Make it a Colorado, just make it a constitutional provision. So we know that in addition to those to taking away the authority of elected officials to set tax policy, we also know that Article 10, Section 20 says if the revenue grows, if revenue to the state of Colorado or any other district, school districts, cities, counties, etc., grows faster than the rate of inflation plus population, the money needs to be returned to taxpayers. Right? And a lot of people think, wow, well, that's a really darn good idea. I don't want government to grow out of control. Who wants government to grow out of control? Raise your hands. Right? Nobody wants government to grow out of control. I would suggest to you that that's not what this formula does either. The formula doesn't allow communities to thrive because what it actually does is it restricts growth to inflation plus population each year, and governments buy teachers, not toasters. CPI, the measure of inflation included in the Constitution, measures the cost and the changing of cost of consumer goods. Think about it for a minute. When was the last time you bought a television set? Think about it. Think about the TV you bought before that. As a percentage of your income, did that television get cheaper or more expensive? Cheaper. It's called productivity enhancement. It's what we do. We drive consumer costs down. Think about the same thing. Last time if you have an employee, or if you are an employee, your health insurance costs. Think about the last time you had to change your health insurance and the time before that. Were your health insurance more expensive or less? More, right? That's what governments tend to buy, are costs of people, not costs of consumer goods. That's what happens when you drop stuff. That is particularly significant. That notion of it not measuring what it is that government buys becomes particularly important when you look at all of these items. What's happened to the cost of education, Medicare, prescription drugs, transportation, compared to all items? These things have grown in price so much more fast, so much more quickly. But yet revenue is limited to this. And what does that mean? We can buy less of these things every year. It's just the way the system works. It's not good or bad. I'm not here to argue one way or another, but that is the effect of the inflation plus population component. The other thing that it doesn't, that it ignores, is the changing demographics over time. I know no one in this room is getting older, but all those people out there are getting older. And we are increasingly aging as a population. Our median age is going up. Colorado used to be considered a young state. Now we're kind of an average state. Even with all these damn millennials. Oh, there it was. Even with all the millennials coming in. Now, Nothing wrong with old people. I'm just about one of them myself someday. But let me point out a couple of facts about us and our aging population. One, we cost more. We tend to require more health insurance, health costs. We require other kinds of services. But the thing that people don't think about very often is that we don't earn or spend as much either. One of my economist friends always talks about how her mom taught her to take a hostess gift when she went to someone's house for dinner, right? You know, you take a bottle of wine, or you take a candle, or, you know, you take one of those little things that you put around your wine glass to make sure that you know whose it is. You know the ones I'm talking about. You buy them on sale and you put them in your drawer. Come on, ladies, you know what I'm talking about. And that she used to always take them, and now as she hangs out with people who are aging, not only do they stop her at the door and say, don't bring this gift in, they try to give her a couple, 3 things when she leaves, right? Because we're all trying to simplify. We don't earn as much and we don't buy as much. Which means we're generating less money to pay for kids, to pay for transportation, to help offset the cost of higher education, etc. Another reason why that formula just doesn't work. I'm going to skip this. Natalie talked about it. If it doesn't, revenue grows faster than inflation plus population, we give it back. This is a kind of a conglomeration of what I've talked about. But remember when I said that in the 1980s we spent about $500 over the national average? Today, Colorado spends $2,053 less per student than the national average. And I know our kids are smart. I know we're great parents and we send our kids prepared to go to school. But think about what a classroom would look like. If a classroom of 30 kids had $60,000 more to provide resources to that classroom. That's where we are. That's the shift we've made since the early 80s. Now, I don't want to talk too much about Amendment 23 because I think people like to blame it. Here's my message about Amendment 23. It is functionally irrelevant. Amendment 23 is a constitutional amendment adopted by voters in 2000 saying that we wanted per pupil inflation to keep up with, per pupil funding to keep up with inflation. The way we were going to do that is for 10 years it was going to be inflation plus 1% with the goal of getting us back to where we were in 1988. We did that. We are currently, in about 2007, we were at the 1988 level adjusted for inflation. And then we had the Great Recession. And Natalie talked to you about the negative factor. And our very creative legislative leaders, and I mean that with all seriousness because they were facing a heck of a problem because the economy was in the toilet. We had a lot of services that needed to be provided. They figured out how they could save money, and they did it by reducing the amount of money that was available through the formula in that factors section that I talked about at the beginning. The Supreme Court has said that that was okay. So I'm not going to spend any more time talking about Amendment 23 because it's irrelevant. The legislature still has the authority to continue to reduce the money that goes into the formula by using the negative factor. If we would have simply kept up with inflation and per pupil funding since 2009-10, in 16-17 we would have gotten an additional $1,000 and set $1,046 more per kid. The 2000 number that I was talking about earlier is how far we are below the national average. Let's ignore that for a minute. Let's just say we kept up with inflation. With inflation, a measure that doesn't measure what it actually costs to provide an education, but we're $1,000 below that. Think about what your classrooms would look like if there were $30,000 more. I think this chart sums it up. In 1993, Colorado ranked 23rd in per pupil funding And by that 2013, we dropped to 40th. Let me say something, it isn't all about money, I understand that. And anybody who tells you that it's all about money is just flat wrong. It's about what the kids bring to the classroom. It's about the quality and the preparation of the teachers and the professionals in a classroom and in a school building. All of those things factor together. But let me suggest to you, it is tough to have all those other things work out when there aren't the resources that are needed. School finance is just one obligation that we take on at the state and as taxpayers in the state of Colorado. It's a big one. It's about 38% of what that all state tax dollars go to support K-12 education. But these other things are important too. And because of the constraints that we've imposed upon ourselves, we don't have the option to make the pie bigger very often. We just change the way we slice the pie. And because we've been doing this for 24 years, there's not a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse left. I will suggest to you in an exercise that we do generally, if I have more time to make this presentation, I would now be handing you a piece of paper and I would ask you to individually design a budget. How would you allocate your dollars if you were a legislator? And then I would ask you in a group to come up with an agreed-to budget. If you think the first exercise is hard, just think about the second one. Because I can guarantee to you somewhere in Colorado tonight, there is a group of people in a room, in a high school, talking about the need for funding for mental health services, transportation, higher education, child welfare services, parks, outdoors, a whole myriad of things. And we've put ourselves in a situation where we're all fighting against one another because we've constrained the size of the pie. Please recognize that in Colorado, when measured as governments, the size of state government, we rank second to the last. Size of state government is dollars spent on state government as a portion of state domestic product. The only state smaller is Texas. We rank 45th in taxes paid per $1,000 of income. 45th. Now, I'm not even proposing that we do anything about it, but I am encouraging you to continue to do what you're doing here, and that is learn about these things. Be advocates. Answer questions. Don't be afraid to talk about budgets, taxes, government, for crying out loud. Because these are the things that make a difference in the quality of your lives, the quality of the community that you live in, and the future of your kids going forward. I'm going to stop. How did I do? Whoever it is, where's fine. I can maybe take 1, 2, 3 questions. If anybody has any questions, comments, something I didn't say that you'd want to know, something I said you didn't understand, something I said that you'd like to argue with me about. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a different factor you would plug in versus inflation?
Yeah. I mean, I think that if we were to design a formula, if we decided we had to have a formula in the Constitution limiting size of government, and this is the point at which I can make a crude joke about size, but I won't. If we could get beyond the size conversation, I think sort of making sure that government never occupied a bigger part of the economy than it currently does. And I would suggest to you that CPI is not that measure, so we could look at personal income or gross domestic product. So how much stuff do we make? What's the value of the stuff that we make and the transactions that we have? And then just make sure that government never gets bigger than it is now or was then. I will tell you, if that were the measure that had been in Article 10, Section 20, 1992, we would have about $3.5 billion more cap room, more space We wouldn't be giving money back. At the Colorado Fiscal Institute, we call it the Colorado Conundrum. We have one of the fastest growing economies in the country, and we're cutting the heck out of schools and higher education and other services because of that formula that I talked about. You will be having an opportunity to cast your vote on whether that makes any sense in November. But I would use something like personal income or state domestic, SDP, state domestic product. Several states in the country use those kinds of measures. And those are measures that limit the growth in government as opposed to the formula that we have that actually shrinks the size of government over time. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
The state funding, is it restricted to how it's spent? Is it for people funding? Is that include building construction or just classroom teacher salaries, et cetera?
It does not include, did we hear the question? The question is whether is there restrictions on how the state money can be used. The per pupil funding that I was talking about here is not construction money at all. It is only money that goes to support classrooms, administration, testing, all the stuff that the state does. Some people argue not really pay for the stuff the state mandates, but that's the theory. Other questions, comments? Yes? Oh, that's such a good question. So one way we can make the pie bigger is that there will be a ballot measure on the ballot in October, or in November, I guess October, because the ballots come to our houses these days. Not sure what it's going to say yet. There were 3 proposals filed today that would ask us as voters, as part of what's allowed and encouraged in Article 10, Section 20, ask us whether or not it's okay if the state legislature keeps and uses all the tax dollars they collect at our existing tax rates. Some of those proposals that have been proposed some of them are 10 years in the limit, some of them are permanent. One of those is going to be sorted out. At some point, you'll get through the process. You, as a voter in Colorado, will have the opportunity to make a decision whether you're going to let that happen. That doesn't expand the size of the pie dramatically, but it keeps us from shrinking the pie relative to economic activity. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to actually see if we can put a tax increase on the ballot and ask us all to contribute a little bit more. You might remember that we did that in 2014 with Amendment 66. That was wildly popular now, wasn't it? But those are really the options. I think that at some point we're going to be dealing with, the legislature has some options to temporarily deal with the problem with something called a hospital provider fee, would allow us to not have to give back Article 10 rebates, which would allow the state to be able to keep and use the money it collects at existing tax rates. I think that would be important. I think that we adopted these provisions back in 1992, and had I had a little more time, we would have developed this whole thing about what's the same as it is in 1992. And I think that we really need to think about the economy. And yeah, we can make jokes about how many phones you've had, and how many cars you've owned, and how many home computers you've had. But if you really think about the structure of our economy, it has changed dramatically over time, and our economic policy is locked into the Constitution. And at some point, we need to have a statewide conversation about whether that makes sense. Maybe we should have some limit in the size of government because we're Coloradans, Westerners. We don't want big government. I mean, who does? But maybe it's time for us to reconsider that. That won't happen in 16, but it will happen at some point. Anybody else? Comments? Questions? I just want to say thank you so very much for doing what you're doing. You're giving up a Tuesday evening to come learn about something that most people don't even want to talk about. And like I said, my mom told me never to talk about. I really encourage you. I'm going to leave some of these Count Me In sheets. I know that Kathy and Priscilla will pick them up and make sure that I get them. We will reach out to you if you're interested in this and let you know about these train-the-trainer options so that you can come and spend a few hours really digging in and getting really nerdy about this stuff. I know that is attractive. There's a few of you who are part of the nerd herd. And we'd love to have you. The other thing I want to say is if you belong to other groups where you think it would be valuable for people to understand this information a little bit better, but you don't feel comfortable doing it, my organization sends out speakers to do this. I do a lot of them as well as our economist, Chris Stifler, does a lot of these presentations. We hope they're accessible. We hope they make sense to you. We hope we're putting them in a context that allows you to feel like maybe you're starting to get it. This is probably 3, 4, or 5 times. Hang in there, because 6 or 7 times it'll be something that you'll be a lot more comfortable with. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to chat with you tonight.
Reiteration of some of the things you heard from both Natalie and Carol, but it's going to be definitely down at our local level. This evening's presentation, or the meeting tonight, was called Increasing Expenses and Limited Revenue. What I would tell you honestly, what I consider this is a state with an increasing population, increasing legislation on how we're supposed to educate our students, with a reduction in the state's financial support. So my expenses can't increase because they're not giving us the money that we need to meet those requirements. So in the news, we hear that the Colorado's economy is continuing to improve, recover. We've got great low unemployment. Our assessed values went up, as everybody's talked about. So of course, this is great for K-12. It's a little bit also counterintuitive. So the way that the state has us do our budget process is we have our Board of Education, and I know this is hard to say, approve our budget by June. It's required by law. So in June of 2015, the district the board approved its budget. But I'm funded based on student count. And we get that, so even though it's an October 1st count, we know that number somewhere about the November, December timeframe. So about 4 or 5 months after we've started the year, I know how many kids that I'm going to get funded for. On March 2nd, they finished the supplemental, which actually told me what my per pupil revenue. So all those kids that they told me about in October, November, December, I didn't actually know what each kid was going to be funded until March 2nd. So now we're talking 8 months after in the year. We've had to staff the buildings. We've had to do all kinds of, we've had to buy curriculum and all this stuff. But really, it's 8 months into my school year that I actually know how much money that we're going to get. So how much money is that for Adams 12? We're going to talk just general fund. One thing that I would like to point out is the district's budget is about 12 funds. We're going to focus just on the general fund, which has got our state support in it. 82% of Adams 12 general fund, or 81.2%, is funded by the formula that Natalie and Carol had been talking about. The funding component, again, state equalization, as we've said, about that 80 to 82%, our property taxes, and the one thing to note, that we've got the mill levy override. That doesn't go into the formula, that's not part of the formula, it's outside of that, so it's in addition to the money. Of new revenue, the $10 million of expenses, what do? Our potential adjustments are expense reductions. We don't have the ability to raise revenue. As everybody's talked about, the only way to raise revenue is through a vote of the people. So, we did a salary freeze for our employees. That's $5.6 million. In one of Carol's handouts, she noted that the unemployment in Adams County is just over 3%. So you do a salary freeze. you find yourself in a situation where it's hard to be competitive in a low unemployment market. 1% reduction in our expenditures gets us about $2.9 million just for the general fund. Realizing that the general fund is 90.8% salaries and benefits, there's no way you get around that without impacting people. Reduce the funds available for our capital maintenance and ongoing maintenance projects to $2.5 million. I think anybody that was here the last time knew about what we've got in deferred maintenance already, but this continues to create an issue of our day-to-day and being able to support day-to-day maintenance in our buildings. Reduction of class size mitigation staffing at elementary schools, $1.2 million. Additional staff that we put in to make sure that we didn't have class sizes that were unmanageable. If we take that staff away, we're looking at that potential of increased class sizes, changes in programs, possibly. Reduction of an annual textbook funding. Well, that just delays curriculum. And everybody knows how fast all this stuff changes. We're already delayed in getting curriculum. We just delay that further. This is what we've got. So at some point, the expenditure reductions have a limit. And we do have to have the conversation about what do we do to increase revenue. That was me going as quickly as possible so to keep everybody on time. Are there any questions? Yeah.
I think we all see that it's been getting worse and worse and worse. But I don't have a good feel for how much we need to make it better. So in terms of per pupil funding, what would your number be that the school district would be fully funded?
My fully funded on formula is $8,100.
But that's not my question. My question is, if we wanted to do everything we wanted to do, what would that number be? So there's a formula, but I don't know if that's above or below or way below or what.
How much money would you have to raise in order for that to happen? Is that kind of what you mean?
Well, so would you like to see 8,000 per student, 9,000 per student, 10,000 per student?
But that doesn't go for capital expenditures, right?
It doesn't go towards capital expenditures. So this is, there's a lot, yes, there, you know what, I'm gonna let Chris tell you.
You bet. So for those of you who I've not met before, I'm Chris Gajowski, superintendent here in Adams 12. The way I would answer your question is if we aspire to get just to the national average in terms of funding, we need $80 million more per year in Adams 12 to get there. That's a big number. And there's a good argument to be made that we need even more than that, because this isn't a cheap place to live. In terms of what people spend, housing is probably the biggest component of what you spend out of your monthly income. And we're one of the most expensive places in the United States to live. And so when you look at 91% of our budget being for salary and benefits, the amounts we're paying our staff, especially young people who are just getting into the housing market now, they really can't survive. So I can make an argument even bigger than 80 million, but I think that's a fair place to go.
So if we were to pass the mill levy, would that decrease the amount of funding we get from the state?
No, a mill levy override does not impact our total formula funding. It's in addition.
Would you give the definition of that override? Mill levy override, what that means?
Mill levy override is additional revenue available to the local, the school district, raised locally.
How does that work though? I mean, when I get my tax bill, I just have a rate on it. What does that mean when you do an override of that?
We will increase the mills that we will assess you, so when you
So
look
my
at
taxes actually increase, right, as a property owner in the district?
your mills will increase, yes,
Okay,
correct.
and my question is on the override, do voters vote on that?
Yes, on an override voters vote.
So the other thing, I think there's just so many parts of our tax system that are very confusing and difficult to understand. There's 3 different types of taxes that you'll see on your tax bill that send money our way. One is what they call this total program levy, which has really been the focus of most of tonight's discussion. That's 27 mills in Adams 12 in most places in the state. Then because we've had our voters 4 times over the last 20 plus years say, we want you to have more money, either so that you're not making more cuts to the budget, or once upon a time, way before Tabor, maybe there's some new things we wanted to add in. There's another levy that brings us about $35 million total per year, and that's about 17 mills. And then the third piece is that we've asked for people to give us more money a number of times in the past to build facilities or to repair facilities. And so that's a bond redemption levy that's on your taxes, and that's about 21 mills. So you add all 3 of those up and you're at 65. Roughly 27 of them just for basic state-funded operations, 17 more for things that our community said, we know that you need more, or you've persuaded us that we should invest more, and a facility piece of about 21 mills. The other thing that can be confusing is you lost without any state funding. And from a lot of very bright people, 20 mills or some astronomical number, and people don't understand it, but that's truly how much it would be if we had no state support.
Just explain how we went from more mills or overrides or bonds that they couldn't potentially not raise your taxes. There was a comment about you would raise my bill, but is it possible that we could ask more without it?
The way we have our debt structured, that we could increase and go out and ask for an impact that we currently assess or impact it would have.
So I'll add to that. She's been learning the play-by-play. So in terms of where we're at, we've not had any new debt issued or new bonded revenue come in for more than 12 years. So we've paid down a lot of debt the last 12 years. We've also refinanced our debt to lower interest rates so that we're paying less expense in interest. We've also done some things in some cases to pay off debt quicker. You add all that together, and we're now at a spot where we could probably raise $200 to $300 million to deal with facility repairs and new school construction, and also get in the ballpark of $5 million per year on operating funds, these overrides, without increasing people's tax rate. So that's one possibility that our board will consider. They'll likely also consider other options to do easier to message that on a very long ballot. That's going to have 12 questions on it potentially. I'm going to study that and see where that lands. And then I would imagine them to consider a third option, which is get money in for facilities, and let's do an override on top that does increase taxes because the needs are so great. And those will be discussions that our board has throughout the spring into August, and then they'll make a decision about what's going to be on the ballot. Yeah.
Talk about what it looks like if you ask for facilities money but no operating money to put into
Sure, that question for those on this side of the room is, what does it look like if you ask for bond money to build new facilities or to offer new programs like additional career and technical ed programming, which is something people have been debating on one of our committees, or if we expand preschool opportunities for kids. If you only get the money in to build the building, but no new money to operate those programs, then you're having to make reductions elsewhere in your system to operate the new programs, especially when you're in the environment that we are now. When you have flat growth, you don't have new kids coming in with new revenue that you can allocate to operate new things. If we were growing by 400 or 500 kids per year, like we were 15 years ago, it's a little bit different story. But right now, we would not be able to open new programs or new buildings without new operating revenue, without being forced to have to make cuts elsewhere in the system to pay for those new buildings and to operate them.
So, and I guess that, I need to just get a clarification. On one of the slides that you showed, you said you anticipated 12, was it 12?
It's a decline of 12 kids in the whole system for next year.
Okay, and so what we're looking at then is some geographic areas are growing, which is where the facilities are needed, but there are other geographic areas that are older and families don't have any kids anymore, is that correct?
That's correct. The aging piece is an important part of why some schools are declining in enrollment, But frankly, another dynamic that's new this year is that rents are getting increased so substantially that people can't afford, even in the lower income parts of our community, to pay rent, and so they're moving on. You're right. Yes.
No,
Oh.
it's okay. Go ahead.
Of the $10 million of new increase in expenditures, can you break down what they are, and what's legislated as a requirement, and
So I'll jump in. Actually, I'm going to let Suzi do this because she probably knows the numbers better, and I'll see if I feel like I need to supplement.
So what I would tell you specifically on the legislative piece is going to be our increase in the pension in the para, which is a component of that $1.6 million, which is about $1 million of that $1.6 million. The other component, health insurance increases, those aren't legislated. It's just the health insurance premiums that are providing our families, or our employees. None of the salary increases are legislated, required. They are inclusive of years of experience in education. So one of those is going to be in this year. We did give an increase. We gave it mid-year. And so there's about a $2.2 million increase in the next fiscal year to take care of that for a full year. An annual increase of about 2.25%. It's about $5.6 million. So that would be next year adding that. And in addition, where we talk with education, changes for our educators, going back, more education, it's about $400,000 a year the cost to the district to do those increases.
What's the contract term for teachers? Term, is it 1 year, 2 years, your contract for teachers? You don't have to answer that.
So the question is, what is our contract term with teachers? And it's a little bit of a complicated question because for the first 3 years that folks work, it's generally a 1-year contract, and if they're meeting expectations and we have enough enrollment, our negotiated contract is currently 3 years, is my recollection. Yeah. Charlene, you want to go next?
Yeah, so you talked about salary increases. I know for a while, for a number of years, our staff didn't see any salary increases. I also know that we're lagging behind other area districts. Can you address those two issues? Because I think that's important information.
So it's true, we had a year where not only did people not have an increase, we actually had a decrease to account for some of these pension cost increases that were mandated. So that was true in the past. Beyond that, we've had lots of years where we've done mid-year increases as opposed to full-year increases because we just didn't feel like there's enough money to do it the full year. Where that leaves us is that we have neighbors in Boulder Valley. I believe their starting salary for a teacher is about $42,000 or $43,000 per year. For us, it's about $35,000 per year. When you look at Westminster District 50, I don't know exactly what their current number is. Years ago, probably 5, 6, or more years ago, they increased starting salary to $40,000 per year. And I assume they've probably done some upward adjustments since. So we're lagging behind some of those people who are very close geographically to us. And it becomes more and more difficult to be competitive in the environment for new teachers. Did you have a question there?
I have a question, but it could be
Okay. Yes.
Could you just talk a little bit about, especially in areas where there's a lot of new growth, how much money we might get from, say, a new home that's constructed and why that doesn't necessarily go directly into the schools?
So that goes along with how the formula works and what everybody was. So the question was, in the areas of growth that we have, can we explain how that increase does or does not go to the schools and that additional revenue for those growing population areas? So as I think both Natalie and Carol explained, it goes along with just your increased assessed value. Just because those areas are increasing, the district's total assessed valuation increases. That doesn't mean that the district sees it because at the end of the formula, the state equalizes.
in our 82%, what they do is basically say, well, you've got additional property taxes, so we're going to back down our support because you are supported greater on your local taxes. They use it to balance the rest of their budget. So in any growth areas, we're not seeing those additional tax dollars.
The other thing that's here related to that question is there's a big misperception in many parts of our community that when new homes are built, the people buying those homes or the developer are going out and in turn building new schools to serve those kids. It's simply not the case. So in parts of our community in Broomfield, a new homeowner pays about $1 per square foot into this pot that the city of Broomfield and we can both access for joint development projects like a soccer field or a playground or a gymnasium that we would both use. But it's a pretty modest amount of money, $2,500 to $3,000 per home, typically that gets into that pot. It's not anywhere close to the $35 to $40 million cost when you have people paying in at that rate necessary to build a new K-8 school. So to the extent you believe that developers and new home owners are putting in money to build the new schools on the capital, it's not even close. And then there's places in our city like Thornton, there's not a requirement towards school site acquisition or construction. We have to go out and try to negotiate that case by case. And then Westminster's kind of in between where they have a formula, but it uses land values from 15 or 20 years ago, so it generates very little money to help us out.
So we're coming up on time, so we have time for one more question. Thank you so much for everyone's engagement.
I have a question on that kind of follow-up. It may be too long for tonight, but I don't quite understand why that's the case. Why city councils aren't held accountable for when they are approving these home sites and they're approving this. The district isn't working with the cities and the developers. The city is working with developers like kind of a chain. Adams12 working with the city, Thornton, Broomfield saying, we need your help with these developers. It brings some pressure on the city to do that. Because they're really responsible in building development. Are being responsible and allowing these homes to be developed and not having anywhere for these kids to go to school. So I just guess why isn't there that? Why isn't that approach?
So I would say there are more that some cities could do. I think that's a fair comment. There are cities that could ask the developers or demand that developers pay more towards school construction, but there's also limits on cities. When you look at this legal maze in Colorado, one of the other components that we've not talked about is a Supreme Court decision from years ago where Douglas County in their big boom days, when they went from being like 4,000 kids up to 50,000, they tried to charge impact fees on every new home and on developers to pay more into the school construction fund, and the no, you can't. So there's just so many restrictions that make it tough, even if you that wants to help.
Thank you so much.
This is what we need from you. We need you to share what you learned. If every single person in this room would talk to 10 people, if those people would talk to 10 people, and so on and so forth, if we were to go for a mill bond, it wouldn't be like in the past. This would be something that the community would be motivated for, and this would be something that we would demand of our school board that we elected. We would tell them this is what we want on our ballot. The next thing we can do is just learn more. Get online. Watch this again. Find out more. Get your questions answered. Come to our next forum. It's in April. Am I correct? April 28th is our next one, and I believe it's at Silver Hills. There'll be more information, so please give us your contact information. It's going to have a different topic. We want to talk about different things. It's not just the general fund. It's capital expenditures. It's where our funding comes from. It's other issues that are going on in the district, the demands of our students as well that we do want to talk about. Advocate. If you know anyone who is elected, you force them to have this conversation with you. You let them know that you're informed. You let them know what we need as a constituency. And of course, get involved. Get involved with us, get involved in your community, get involved in whatever seems pertinent in order to make a change, the changes that you want to see. We have an online parent survey that we would really love for you guys to engage with, and this is the one through Adams12, is that correct? Okay, so if you've received that email, if you haven't received that email, I believe you can see that on the Adams12 website. Sorry? Does it, oh, it's another one. You have to complete it by mid-April. I'm sorry, I just did one.
I know, we just did one.
And you're throwing me off, Kathy, go ahead.
Well, this information was added at about 4:30 p.m. because it resulted from a meeting we had earlier. So Shannon's never seen this, so I'm just going to jump in.
Thank you.
So what we're doing as a district is we really want to listen to the community. So this part of we need to know what you all think. So in order to do that, we're going to try that in a few different ways. There will be another online parent survey in mid-April. We spaced it. We had the parent survey where you talked about how your kids were treated and how as families you feel welcome in our schools. This one is going to be more focused on what you see as needs, what you feel your kids need, what we might want to see if we did put something on the ballot. It's just kind of another assessment of where you are and what you feel, what you want to tell the district. We are going to also put on a telephone town hall in late April, so you can call in and be part of a conversation. Again, all listening. 2014, we missed the mark somehow. We don't want to do that again. We want to hear what people have to say and get your input in before we make any decisions about what to do. Do we put a bond on in the fall? Do we put a mill? I'll just tell you, I'm on the school board. There are 3 other school board members. It's kind of a meeting. We're all here separately learning the same information because we are constantly trying to also hear from the community, but the district is putting on a telephone town hall in late April. There will be school facility scorecards that are going to be sent out to each school, and parents should be receiving those. So we want you to look at those. We want you to understand the needs at your children's schools so that you know what the facility needs are there. We are also going to, Carol Hedges mentioned voter registration, but what we learned from our last bond and mill is about half, well, we've done the numbers now, of our district parents and community members aren't registered to vote. So if we had had all our parents and teachers vote in the last election, we might have been able to pass our bond and mill. So we are going to be doing our own voter registration efforts because we feel it's very important. We're not going to obviously tell people how to vote, but you need to be civically engaged, and so we want to increase that population of our parents that can vote. So if your registration is not up to date, check it out, website, and I recommend signing on to work, and we are going to have other opportunities, kind of our game plan for some concrete things you can do. So, sorry, Shannon.
It's okay, it's just color commentary.
I had to have
Say one more time, as a parent in the community, as a definitely not an employee or a board member, I just want you to know that I'm giving up my evenings, I'm giving up my weekends, I'm giving up my free time to be involved in this because I'm passionate about how we educate our kids. I'm passionate about the work you guys do. I think Carol did a great job talking about how people are not commodities, that we don't buy them, and it's something different. And I want you guys to know that there's people in the community that believe in that, and we support you. And we need you to support efforts as we go forward and just talk to so that we can go out together and do what's right for our kids and for our school district. So thank you for your time tonight. Thank you to all of our wonderful speakers. One more thing, people about this Mythbusters piece on where our money comes from.
Please add your name to this sheet.